I'm back here on Under the Ring. So pleased to be joined by Eric Bischoff, the former president of WCW, noted pro wrestling executive, and disruptor to the system of pro wrestling. Eric, so good to have you here on Under the Ring.
This is the first time I've ever been introduced as a disruptor. So I think, the term's been overused, but I think I kind of dig it. Thank you very much. Great to be here, Phil. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you. First off, what's it like being in the podcast game for you now? You're now with 83 weeks and with the business of the business with ad-free shows. What do you like about it? What do you like about the process?
Man, I could talk for hours about it. Number one, first and foremost, for me doing the podcast, it was very cathartic for me. If you go back and you listen to some of the first podcasts that Conrad Thompson and I did early on, 4 years ago now, I was really defensive, because I had spent the majority of my career kind of being on the receiving end of the wrestling narrative and the dirt sheets and the peripheral wrestling media, and didn't really have a platform to respond. Every once in a while I would, but it was difficult because that platform didn't exist. And when I first started doing the podcast with Conrad, I found myself kind of being defensive. Conrad would press, and of course, Conrad comes at the podcast as my co-host, from the fans' perspective, people that didn't really know what was really going on behind the scenes. And as a result, of me being somewhat defensive, not somewhat, I was very defensive. It was uncomfortable for both of us, and it wasn't good. And then it took me about 6 or 8 weeks, and I started having fun with it. And I used to box. I was involved in martial arts and fought competitively for a long time. And one of the first things you learn, in boxing or in martial arts is, protect your chin, keep your hands up right here. Right. And after about 6 or 8 weeks, I realized that I'd have a lot more fun if I just dropped my hands and lead with my chin and have fun with it. And once I started having fun with it, it changed everything for me. It changed the way I reacted. It changed the way I told stories. It changed everything. And as a result of that, I have a lot more fun now talking about or thinking about, even when I'm being criticized or when someone challenges me on something, it's now fun for me as opposed to, I got to counter that. I got to throw that left hook. Got to sneak that left hook in there somewhere. I don't have that same approach. So it's been really, really fun. And, Strictly Business, which we do on adfreeshows.com, that's a whole different experience because I'm talking about the business of the wrestling business. And there are a lot of wrestling podcasts out there, and they're all great, but there's not one of them. There's not one podcast host or co-host out there that can speak to the business of the wrestling business with as much authority and experience as I do, because that's where I lived. I wasn't a wrestler. I didn't do road trips. I can't tell you funny stories, but I can tell you all about, CPMs. I can explain what a gap principle is and how it affects, the professional wrestling business, or how it affected WCW at least. I can talk about that stuff all day long. And that's information that the audience really can't get anywhere else. And I have a blast doing that.
A big part of your rise in wrestling was the NWO and the Outsiders. But, looking back on your career, you were the outsider. I mentioned before, kind of referring to you as the ultimate disruptor. Was there one thing any more difficult than other things in your rise in the wrestling business, not being a wrestling guy, getting in, not being a legacy kind of generational, and being that business person and being that, kind of entrepreneur?
No, the truth is, had I been more of a traditional, had I come from a more traditional kind of wrestling, family or genealogy, I probably would have never had the opportunity that I did in Turner Broadcasting. Turner Broadcasting was looking for somebody who wasn't a quote unquote wrestling guy. They had experimented with wrestling guys, Dusty Rhodes, Bill Watts, before me, and Ole Anderson, not necessarily as a manager in the company, but he had a lot of input. And Turner decided back in 1993, after the Bill Watts disaster, that they wanted an executive to run WCW that had a television background and a business background, not necessarily a wrestling background. Of course, my wrestling experience, I came to WCW from the AWA. I my first job in the wrestling industry was in television syndication, which means I had to learn all about ad sales. I had to learn about ratings and how to sell wrestling to people who weren't necessarily excited about the wrestling product. And in order to do that, you have to understand the business of the wrestling business and why it can benefit a television station in syndication. So learning the business from the ground up, I learned, production simply because I was fascinated by it and I had access to it. So I was an intern while I was, running sales and syndication for the AWA. In the evenings, I would sit in during post-production sessions and learn how to edit, learn how to mix. I ran dub machines. I often spent weekends, dubbing tapes, and I learned that from the ground up. I went from that to, running a camera and shooting interviews in production. And I went from that to being in front of the camera, all of that before I came to WCW. I promoted, small live events around the Midwest. So I had a little bit of an understanding of promotion and how it works. So I had a little bit of knowledge of so many different aspects of the wrestling industry before I came to WCW that I think it qualified me in the eyes of a few people, Bill Shaw in particular, the guy who hired me for the position, because I did have a wrestling background and understanding, but I saw the opportunity more from a television experience or perspective than a wrestler's experience or perspective.
Right. To me, WCW gets talked about plenty about what happened at the end of it. But, researching for this episode, the legacy of WCW, to me, you changed the format of TV wrestling permanently. You changed the format of pay-per-view permanently. And everyone in wrestling made a lot more money than they probably should have had WCW not existed. What to you is the legacy of what you accomplished in WCW?
Well, I think you touched on it. Innovation. When I had my meeting with Ted Turner and Ted looked at me and said, "Okay, Eric, you're going to go head to head with WWE every Monday night." I didn't expect that. I didn't want that. Had never thought about that. It wasn't on my list of things to do. It blindsided me. But when I walked out of Ted's office, before I even got to my own office, I was in the CNN Center. There was a bridge across the north side of the CNN Center and the south side of CNN Center overlooking the atrium and the food court and the retail shops and all that in CNN. And I stopped on that bridge and had a conversation with myself in my head. And I knew right then in that moment that the only way that I was going to be successful was to be different than WWE. And I finished my walk back to my office and I sat down with a pen and paper and I made a list of all the ways I could be different than WWE. And at the very top of that list was to go live. WWE was taped. All right, I'm going live. I've always believed that live television is better than tape television anyway, but now I had a reason to do it. And I could justify it because it's more expensive. I think, changing up the format to a live format is one thing, gradually introducing more reality-based storylines, which the obvious one is the NWO, but there were others. I think introducing the luchadors and the cruiserweight division was a massive, massive change in the industry, highlighting people that typically were overlooked in professional wrestling at that time, bringing in the luchadors from Mexico and a lot of the Japanese. Other people had done it before me with regard to, Japanese wrestlers for sure, but I made them a part of the storyline. They weren't just a attraction, once or twice a year. The cruiserweight division became the mainstay and a critical part of the success of Nitro. And what do we see today? You take a look at AEW. There's probably very few people there that tip the scales over 200 pounds. A lot of that had to do with the way the cruiserweight division was presented and accepted and became a thing back in the mid-90s. So I think all of those things are important things, but all of it, if you had to pick one word to kind of describe it, it would just be innovation.
And one of the other things I said, and obviously great answer with all that, and you even look at what they're doing in New Japan right now, which a number of companies have done over the years. But again, WCW was the one that was presenting New Japan to the U.S. back in the 1990s. So
in a storyline way, there is the difference because Bill Watts, before me, had brought in Japanese wrestlers from New Japan. It wasn't like I did it first. I just did it better. And I by better, I mean by integrating, New Japan and again, the luchadors in a regularly scheduled storyline presentation as opposed to one-offs.
But also, you look at some of the things you did with the entertainment business, and you look at kind of the way things are going now. You see Rock and Cena and Dave Bautista are legitimate Hollywood stars now. You have Shaq on AEW. You have all the stuff with Bad Bunny and Logan Paul and Freddie Prinze getting into wrestling now, and Billy Corgan getting into wrestling now. And you kind of see that WCW was probably ahead of the curve in terms of trying to embrace the entertainment industry and get in on the ground floor of it. Would you agree with that?
No, I mean, I appreciate that comment and question, but you look at what WWE did, they brought Liberace in for WrestleMania, and
Right.
Cyndi Lauper and Muhammad Ali before I did, and Lawrence Taylor. And, WWE did it as well. I recognize it for the opportunity that it was and built upon it and participated in it, but I certainly didn't. I wasn't the first one to do it.
Weren't the first one to do it, but I feel like you guys really embraced it, and maybe it wasn't totally popular at times with some of the selections, but it was still getting everybody towards where we are.
Well, you know what it was, and when I ultimately became president of WCW, and it's really funny, going back, and you have this narrative that it's changed now because of podcasts and people like me who've been in the business for a minute or two, and Bruce Pritchard and others who now have podcasts who are behind the scenes and can talk about things. But before podcasts, the only narrative that was out there was really produced by people, wrote dirt sheets, the equivalent of the National Enquirer back in the 60s and 70s, guys like Dave Meltzer and, people that had no understanding at all of the wrestling business. They had no involvement in it. They sat in their, bedrooms and sat in front of their computer and sat on their laptops or their desktops and wrote about the wrestling business and spread rumors and gave their opinions. And one of, the criticisms that I got back in the mid 90s and late 90s, was, Eric Bischoff just wants to be a Hollywood guy. That wasn't true. What was true is that I knew that in order for WCW to become more popular, to become a recognized media property, that we had to expand our footprint beyond just a wrestling show. We had to have, that's one of the reasons we did, Ready to Rumble with Warner Films. It's one of the reasons why I was pursuing, animation. It was one of the reasons why, I worked with Dusty Rhodes and got him with some television appearances. It's one of the reasons why Randy Savage and I, did some things. I was on the show Arliss, and there was a lot of effort and time spent on trying to expand WCW's brand and footprint into other forms of entertainment that would help grow the business beyond just the wrestling ring and the wrestling audience. Got a lot of criticism for that. And now you look at what, WWE's doing and AEW is trying to do. And interestingly enough, I did an interview last week on Strictly Business with a guy by the name of Mick Pandick, he's an attorney, business affairs, Universal Television. And he manages licensing and is involved in streaming rights. And we talked a lot about what's it going to take for AEW, for example, to increase their values with regard to, a streaming opportunity. And one of the things that Mick pointed out is, you have to expand your footprint beyond the wrestling audience. And I just kind of found that interesting. But, it's fun to watch. It's fun to watch the evolution of the business.
Yeah, definitely. One thing people have asked me at times when you study the business, I'm curious your perspective of this. Is the WCW fan still out there and
sure,
available? And who is the WCW fan?
Well, I think, that's a big question. There's not one answer, but if you go back and you look into you look at the mid 90s, late 90s, you look at the audience, our primary audience back then, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, were 18 to 49. And there was a lot of teens and preteens in there as well, but the core audience was 18 to 49. Well, it's 20 years later, and those same fans are there. They're out there. I meet them every time I go to a convention. I meet them every time I go to a Comic-Con, every time I do an autograph signing. My podcast, 83 Weeks, is probably one of the most financially successful podcasts out there in the wrestling industry. And those are WCW fans. So they're still out there. I meet them in person. I talk to them on my podcast every week. I interact with them on social media all the time. So they're still out there. Who are they? They were WWE fans as well. They were wrestling fans. They just happened for a period of a couple of years to prefer WCW because of the nature of our programming, the way it was presented versus the way WWE was being presented at the time. But they were wrestling fans in general. I think if you looked at the hardest core of the WCW audience, generationally, they came from the southeast part of the United States. WCW came about when Ted Turner purchased Jim Crockett Promotions out of bankruptcy and kind of relaunched the NWA product, if you will, renamed it WCW. But a lot of the talent that came over initially were former NWA talent. And NWA was primarily a southeastern part of the United States wrestling company. So that was originally our audience, but because of the things that we did in the mid-90s, we expanded beyond that. We became more popular and more interesting to a much broader audience than we had up until 1995.
Now, you may have a more interesting answer to this than anyone else I've asked so far, but what was your professional and personal relationship like with Vince McMahon, and what's it like now?
Well, I didn't really have a relationship with Vince until I went to work for him in 2001. My relationship prior to that, we were combative. We were competition. And I was loud. I was obnoxious. I was in your face. I called him out. I made fun of him. I gave away the finishes to his tape show on my live show 5 minutes before his show started to make sure that to do my best to make sure that people stuck with us and didn't even bother tuning into him. I did a lot of really controversial, kind of brassy things back in the day. So it was very adversarial, not face-to-face, obviously, because I never came face-to-face with him during that period. But once I went to work for him, man, it's one of my favorite experiences in the wrestling industry. I thought that was just the idea that we could be that. I mean, we were suing each other in federal court. It was just all kinds of nasty stuff going on. But then, you reach that point where, okay, the war's over. Let's join forces and see if we can take over the world together. And that was fun.
And it seems like he likely respects what you accomplished in
I think so.
WCW.
I think so. And even when I went to work for WWE as a talent, I never really got to know Vince much. I didn't work with him directly. I showed up, Monday mornings at the arena, and I got the things that I was going to be doing that day, and worked over it, rehearsed it, whatever talent I was working with. Occasionally I worked with Vince and got to interact with him a little bit, but we never really sat down and talked, which is unfortunate. So one thing I think I regret, I really would love to have sat down and had just a really honest, no time constraints kind of conversation with Vince about that era. Now, I left WWE as a talent, I think in 2006 or 7, whatever it was. I don't even remember anymore. It's a long time ago. And then, back in 2019, Vince hired me to come in and be the executive director of SmackDown on Fox Television. And I was only there for 4 months, but I was working with Vince every single day, almost every single day. And I should say every single night and into the early mornings would be more accurate. And I did get to know him a little bit better then. And I admire him. He's a very, very unique individual. And I think he's got amazing qualities. He's got his own set of weaknesses as well, or flaws, I guess. I don't think he has a weakness, but I would characterize it as flaws. We all do, human beings, right? Nobody's perfect. But I think overall, I have nothing but the utmost respect for Vince.
And I think there might be a price tag on whatever the highlights of that Eric Bischoff, Vince McMahon summit of the Monday Night Wars might be in the future.
Yeah,
so
that would have been fun, right? It would have been fun for the audience too, because now we could have that conversation without the baggage of being defensive, kind of like I was when I first started the podcast with Conrad Thompson, 83 weeks. I was defensive. Had Vince and I had that conversation, even in 2001 or 2002, it might have been a different conversation. Whereas now I think we can both look back and appreciate the competition and appreciate the things that we each did to compete with each other. And in the process, elevate the entire industry.
Any interesting interactions with Ted Turner outside of that famous meeting where Nitro was conceived?
No, that was, that was it, man. That was, I mean, I interacted with Ted beyond that, obviously. Ted would call my office every Tuesday afternoon when the ratings came in for Monday night. And it was always a great conversation. And we laughed and we joked and we high-fived over the phone. But I didn't really spend a lot of FaceTime with Ted. I didn't report directly to Ted. So my interactions with him were, again, Tuesday afternoons and a couple different meetings when it came to really big decisions that had to be made that Ted had to voice an opinion on or make a decision on, be a better way to say it.
Now, you had a unique view of wrestling, both from the creative side and the business side. Is there any person who is the most creative person you've met in wrestling, and why? And is there anyone you always kind of thought could do it, but kind of didn't do it?
Well, I mean, I think from there's no simple or one answer to that or simple answer to that. I think when it came to creative and psychology, because to me they're the same thing, right? People talk all the time about WWE creative or AEW creative, and I do that too. I make that mistake. Creative is really psychology. It's you cannot have great creative without great psychology. Just like you can't have a great movie without great psychology. The psychology in a movie is kind of more in a traditional script format, act 1, act 2, act 3, the hero's journey kind of idea. But Scott Hall, when Scott Hall was engaged and in the right frame of mind, Scott Hall was one of the most creative people I ever worked with. I mean, there were times that I would sit back and listen to Scott kind of explain an idea or vision. And I was like, whoa, this guy gets it. He got it in the ring. He could do more in a ring with a simple hand gesture than most people could in a 20-minute match. He could achieve more by the way he looked in the camera standing outside the ring than most people could, inside the ring. Scott was amazing. Scott had challenges. Scott had baggage, and oftentimes those challenges and that baggage got in the way. But if I had to pick one person who I think was one of the most creative people that I've worked with, it would be Scott Hall. But there were others, Hulk Hogan, Hulk has a reputation and a narrative because he's been in the business for so long. And, a lot of people would be critical of his in-ring wrestling ability, but Hulk knew how to manipulate the audience in a way that got the reaction and the emotion from that audience in a way that very few people have to this day. Hulk was right up there too. And I know that it'll sound funny to today's listeners and audience who've never worked with Hulk, who didn't really see what Hulk could do with the crowd, how he could get them in the palm of his hand and manipulate them and get the emotion out of them that made the show so exciting from a live perspective in the venue, as well as how it registered on television and engaged the television audience as well.
It's funny because I always tell people that I think that Hulk Hogan is one of the greatest workers of all time, which gets an eye roll every time I say it. But, you watch his career and you got a 6'8" or whatever, 310-pound guy making everyone believe that, he is going to get beaten for about 95% of any match. And that's work. That's That's understanding the audience and understanding the crowd that you're in front of.
Well, today, again, and I don't want to be one of those old men shouting at the clouds characters, but, the word work, with social media and so many people, using wrestling terminology that they really don't understand. They just read about it and make it part of their own vernacular and makes it sound like they know what they're talking about. But, Hulk used to say the greatest worker in the business is the one that makes the most money. And, I don't know that you could probably pick any number of talents from Rock to John Cena to even Steve Austin. Steve Austin, because of his injuries. Steve Austin, before his injuries, peak WCW, phenomenal performer inside of the ring, but injuries slowed him down. And he had to learn how to work around those injuries because he couldn't do a lot of the really, really amazing things that he had been capable of doing. But he made the most money. It wasn't that he was the greatest worker in the ring, but he was the greatest worker in the business at that time. Is anybody going to compare Rock to Eddie Guerrero? I don't think so. Eddie Guerrero, if you talk to wrestling fans today, was one of the greatest workers of all time because of his presentation in the ring. That's what today's fans, especially in social media, define as a worker, is your physical presentation in the ring. But I would say that Eddie wasn't even a fraction of the worker that Rock was when it came to making money, obviously.
And we'll make sure that doesn't make headlines anywhere. This isn't, I know controversy creates cash, but I totally agree with you, though.
No, I don't think that, it should be afraid of it or not, but it's a fact. What is a worker?
Define it, right.
A worker in the minds of people that live on Reddit and live on social media and debate back and forth and, criticize each other for their opinions. Their version of a worker is limited to the physical ability in the ring. In my opinion, the greatest worker is a person who can create a character in a persona and tell a story that reaches the masses and generates hundreds of millions of dollars worth of revenue. That's my definition of a worker. But if anybody wants to have a different definition, hey, have at it. I don't think there's anything controversial about it.
And by most definitions, Eddie Guerrero was wonderful anyway. So it's almost
no. I love Eddie Guerrero. Eddie Guerrero is amazing. Eddie Guerrero, I think, changed the industry in his own way. I love Eddie Guerrero. Conrad Thompson and I go back when we do 83 weeks. We often do. We'll go back and look at a pay-per-view or we'll look at a Nitro and kind of break it down. And I can't wait anytime Eddie Guerrero is involved. I know I'm going to have a great time going back and watching that match. Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko. I feel the same way about Dean Malenko. Phenomenal talent. Rey Mysterio, phenomenal talent. You can't compare anybody to those guys. But in the context of who's the best worker, I kind of lean towards the Hulk Hogan definition. The best worker is the guy that made the most money.
Yep. With benefit of hindsight, this is a question that an old WCW friend of mine sent to me. With the benefit of hindsight, is there a creative angle within WCW that you would want to have another crack at to do differently?
Well, this is going to turn into a 6-part series if we go down that road. A lot of them, look, I really is significant in industry changing as the NWO storyline was. Clearly, it didn't end the way I wanted it to end. It was the wrestling version of, what was that television series that was out for a while about the guy who was a kind of a closet killer, psychopath, good guy during the day, bad guy at night. Dexter. Okay. Dexter was a phenomenal series, right? Everybody loved that episode. Couldn't wait to see the next episode. And the ending sucked. People were angry about the ending of the Dexter series. And I the NWO was the wrestling version of Dexter, if you will. So yeah, I'd love to have a chance to go back and take another crack at that under different circumstances. But I don't think about that much. I don't reflect on the past hardly at all.
Okay. And what, with your current podcast, looking at the business, what interests you the most about the current product right now?
It's a tough one. And I try to explain this because I get a lot of heat, when I express my opinion.
You?
No. And so people don't understand, I don't watch wrestling the way 99% of the people that watch wrestling. I look at wrestling from the business perspective. And I love watching the evolution of the business. I love watching the creative in the presentation of the product and how it conforms to the industry trends. Television has changed. You can't do things on television today. We couldn't get away with 2/3 of the things, or probably more than that. 80% of the things that the WWE did back during the Monday Night Wars, they couldn't get away with today. The industry has changed, but it's evolved. It's found its way to survive and prosper and grow. And I love looking for and analyzing those changes and how they meet the challenges of a new entertainment environment.
All right, we're going to move to something we've been calling the 3 count. It's going to be 3 quick questions and your responses. So here we go. So you've hosted WCW events at the Mall of America, Disney, Club La Vila, Sturgis Motorcycle Rally. If you were still doing WCW, what is a unique outside the box setting that would have gotten a WCW show that you would want to do?
Wow. Look, it would have been great. Here's one that I really wanted to do that got shot down by Turner Broadcasting. And it still upsets me to this day if I talk about it too long. But back in 1999, in probably the summer of 99, midsummer, I had a meeting with Gene Simmons of KISS, and we agreed to create and co-promote KISS/WCW merchandise. And part of that was to create KISS-like characters. That's where the demon came from. Yep. And Gene was very excited about it, and so was I. And we were making progress, making good progress. I brought KISS in, and they were part of a live show in Las Vegas that I got a lot of criticism for, by the way, of course. But the goal in the strategy was to have a pay-per-view on December 31st, 1999. And if you remember back then, you might have been too young. I don't know how old you are. But everybody was so afraid of what was going to happen at the turn of the century. People thought that planes were going to fall out of the sky, computers were going to shut down, the energy infrastructure was going to collapse, the world was going to come to an end, at the stroke of midnight, right? And I thought, wow, what a great time to have a pay-per-view. So I had talked to the people down in Tempe, Arizona, and we were going to do a big wrestling. It was going to be a KISS concert on one end of the field and a wrestling event on the other end of the field on December 31st. And the match was going to end at the stroke of midnight Pacific time. And I really, really wanted, Gene wanted to do it. We thought it would be so we'd open up with a KISS song. We go down to the other end of the field in the end zone, and we'd have a wrestling match. We'd come out of the match. We'd go back to the other end of the end zone, have another song from KISS, and it would be that for like 2.5 or 3 hours. And I got shut down because too many people didn't want to work on New Year's Eve because it was over the Christmas holidays and it was New Year's Eve, and a lot of the production people involved put up a fight and didn't want to do it and complained to Turner Broadcasting, and I got shut down. I would have loved to have done that.
All right. Other than Wayne, who was your favorite character on the original version of the Wonder Years, and why?
I like Fred Savage's character. He was a good straight man, right? I like that character quite a bit.
Kevin. All right.
Kevin. Yeah, Kevin. Yeah. I'm old. Hell, I don't have a good memory. You
gotta bring Wayne in there because of the connection with Jason Hervey.
Yeah, Jason Hervey and I became really good friends and ultimately business partners, and created and produced a lot of great television together. Well, I don't know if it was great. It was reality television, so I don't think reality television really falls into the great television category. But we made a lot of money, so I guess, hey, it was great, right?
Somebody liked it. So you have a time machine and you're allowed to book one historical figure, doesn't have to be wrestling, into pro wrestling. Who would it be and why? And what would they do?
Gosh, if it was today, it'd be Bruce Lee, man. Back in the 60s,
what would you do with 70s?
Bruce Lee was the stuff.
What do you think you'd do with him?
I'd put him over for sure.
I mean, how do you not? It's Bruce Lee.
Yeah, and he'd have to take out somebody much bigger than him. Much bigger than him. Big old 6'6", 350-pound bully. Not bully, the wrestler bully, but you know what I mean, bully.
Right.
Yeah. And just have Bruce Lee come in and just bounce all over the ring and knock the heck out of him.
All right. So,
I'm trying really hard not to cuss on this show. I hope you guys appreciate my efforts here. I'm really, really editing myself in this.
Well, you made it through. So you can catch Eric as part of his podcast, 83 Weeks, and his new one, The Business. I'm messing up the name of this, aren't I?
The name of the show is Strictly Business.
Strictly Business.
I talk about the business of the wrestling business, so it's
right.
Understandable so you confuse it too. But the show is called Strictly Business. It's available at adfreeshows.com, and we talk about nothing but the business of the wrestling business. I think this week we're going to have a special guest on. That I'm not going to drop names right now, but be looking for it. You'll see about it in social media. This individual has a national sports radio show on CBS Sports, and he's a huge wrestling fan. He's a huge sports fan. So we're going to talk about the intersection of sports and professional wrestling and where there are parallels and where there's not. So I think that'll be a fascinating take.
Well, we thank you very much for joining us today, Eric. I could talk about wrestling with you and business and everything else for hours if I wanted to, but we really do appreciate your time today. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Good luck to you, man. I'm here. You guys know how to find me anytime you want to chat. Hit me up.